A Nikon camera lay half buried in the red soil, its film canister cracked, the lens scarred by heat. Inside the rolls of film, blurred frames of elephants and savannas gave way to sudden darkness, the last captured moments of a woman who never returned from her journey. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, 28, last seen alive in Kenya's Masai Mara. Police closed the file in a week, calling it an accident. But her father opened it again, frame by frame, refusing to let the dirt of silence cover the lens. What began as a family search became a battle against an entire system. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Sarah Whitmore arrived in Kenya with 2 cameras, a battered canvas bag, and a list of birds she had hoped to see. She was 28, an amateur photographer who had saved for 2 years to walk the edges of the Masai Mara. On the morning of September 7, 1988, she left her camp pitched near the Talek River. A ranger noted her jeep heading south at 8:15 a.m. She was never seen alive again. By dusk, the camp sat too neatly. The tent was zipped, her bag still inside, the small camp stove cold. Only the jeep was missing. The park warden filed a brief report, perhaps lions, perhaps accident. They wrote her name without detail, without urgency. The sun fell and the savannah closed its doors. The following morning the search began. 2 rangers walked the plain in widening circles, scanning for vultures. Instead, they found a cluster of film canisters in the dust. One cracked open, the roll inside blackened by heat. Each bore the label SW88. No one could explain why the canisters lay a mile from her tent. The report noted them, then moved on. By the 3rd day, Richard Whitmore read the cable in London. The words were flat: daughter missing, safari, presumed accident. He left his office without clearing his desk and boarded a flight to Nairobi the same night. He carried nothing but her childhood photograph and a leather notebook. On the reserve, small anomalies grew sharper. Tire tracks led out of camp, then split. One line curved deeper into the bush, the other veered toward a fire break. The ranger guiding the search dismissed the second set as old, yet the soil still held moisture. Kneeling down, Richard pressed his hand into the imprint of a tread, seeing how fresh the edges looked. He said nothing. At 4:20 p.m., a storm broke over the plains. Rain washed out half the trail, filling the grooves with shallow water. Before darkness, a final clue emerged. Half buried at the base of an acacia tree lay a Nikon FM2, its strap burned through, its lens scarred. No fingerprints, no film inside, only a shallow dent on the body. The rangers lifted it into a plastic bag. The report closed with the words, "Camera recovered. No further significance." The Nikon's shattered lens glinted like an unblinking eye. The next morning, Richard stood at the edge of the reserve, staring across the open land. Grass bent in long sweeps beneath the wind. There were no police grids, no tape, no structured staging areas, just a ranger named Barasa and a mechanic's jeep with a loose steering wheel. Richard asked for the coordinates of the last confirmed sighting. Barasa shrugged. "Somewhere near the West Ridge," he said. They had no logs, no tracker dogs, no forensic team. What they had was a field notebook filled with rough sketches and an attitude of quiet resignation. Richard insisted they return to the site where the camera had been found. It took 2 hours to find it again. The Nikon lay sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve under the dashboard. He requested to hold it. The ranger hesitated. "For what?" "I want to know what she saw last." They drove further south where the second tire trail had veered off, deeper into thickets of fireweed. This trail hadn't been formally logged. Barasa claimed it was an old poacher route, probably inactive. But 40 meters in, the jeep lurched over something half-buried. A scorched patch of grass, roughly the size of a human torso, lay visible under the brush. Richard got out. Kneeling, he found more. Blackened earth, a few melted fragments of synthetic fabric, a scorched button with part of the word "wit" visible. He picked it up using the sleeve of his shirt. Barasa backed away, muttering, "This is nothing. Tourists drop things, fire from lightning." But there had been no storm until after Sarah vanished. They returned to camp before dusk. Richard made notes in his journal. Camera location vs fire patch equals 1, 2 km apart. No animals disturbed tent. Button equals synthetic, partially burned, monogrammed. He requested to speak to the lead investigator. Inspector Joseph Acaro arrived late the next morning. A thick-set man in a pressed tan uniform. He brought 3 cigarettes and 1 empty notepad. He did not shake hands. It was in lion country, Acaro said, leaning against his Land Rover. They find soft parts first. Maybe fire was to scare them. Maybe someone cremated what was left. Kind gesture. Did you test the fire patch? There are no prints, no blood. It's meaningless. Did you test the soil? Mr. Whitmore, Acaro said, exhaling slowly, I understand grief, but this is not London. We do not dig up ghosts for every missing girl. Richard replied, you don't have to, I will. Later that afternoon, Daniel Muriethy arrived. Tall, lean, weathered from years working with conservation programs, he'd heard about the foreign man combing through the bush. He offered help. People around here don't like questions, he said, but I know where they don't want you to look. They went back to the fire patch. Daniel knelt down, collecting a handful of soil into a plastic specimen vial. You'll need someone in Nairobi. I know a lab. 2 days later, the results arrived. The sample contained traces of gasoline, rubber polymer, and polyethylene, consistent with synthetic clothing and camera materials. The report was marked unofficial. The lab technician refused to sign her name. That evening, Richard opened the evidence sleeve containing the Nikon again. Its serial number was half melted, but a technician at the British High Commission confirmed from purchase records that the model was Sarah's, bought at a shop in Islington 2 years earlier. Richard placed the burned button and the vial of soil into a separate zip bag. He taped it shut, labeling it in block letters. Do not discard. At 9:40 p.m. he stood over the map of the reserve pin to the hotel wall. Red string connected 4 points: tent, camera, fire patch, tire fork. The pattern was not random. It bent southeast toward a zone marked land dispute access restricted. He wrote down one line in his notebook and underlined it twice. Who burns a body they never claimed to have found? In a separate envelope, he sealed the scorched synthetic button. 2 more days passed without progress. The official search team disbanded, citing lack of evidence. No press release. No formal withdrawal. Just the slow disintegration of interest. Richard watched their vehicles disappear down the dirt road like retreating shadows. He stayed. At 7:25 a.m., he arrived unannounced at the district police office in Narok. He carried a typed request to access the case file. The clerk, a young man named Elijah, refused at first. Then Richard slid 2 crisp 100-pound notes across the counter. Elijah looked once over his shoulder, then disappeared into the back. He returned 20 minutes later with a brown file, thinner than expected. Inside, a 2-page incident report stating probable wildlife fatality, 1 photocopy of Sarah's passport, 2 black and white photos of the camp taken from distance. No mention of the camera, the fire patch, or the scorched button. There was 1 extra sheet folded into the back, a carbon copy of a witness statement. The name at the top was Rashid Kaimu, age 42, tour assistant. The statement was incomplete, the second page missing, but the first line was clear. I saw 2 men dragging something from the vehicle into the ravine. Richard stared at it for a long time. He looked up. Elijah was gone. The office phone rang once and stopped. He folded the sheet carefully and slid it into the inside lining of his coat. Then he replaced the file, walked out without a word, and locked the door of his hotel room behind him. At 10:15 p.m. that evening, Daniel arrived with news. Kaimu, he said, dead 3 months ago, motorcycle accident on a road with no curves. Richard asked what he meant. Daniel only repeated no curves. They traced Kaimu's known contacts. Most were silent. A bartender in Narok, claimed Kaimu had been afraid before his death, afraid of a name, Peter Njoroj. Peter had been the driver assigned to Sarah's original safari booking, but records at the tour company listed a substitute name the day of her disappearance. Richard made the connection. He found Peter at a roadside garage near Naivasha. A thick man in oil-stained overalls. He refused to speak. Richard showed him Sarah's photo. "Never saw her," Peter grunted, eyes flicking toward a nearby uniformed officer. That night back at the hotel, Richard added a new note to the map. Peter assigned right arrow replaced right arrow Y. The following day, Daniel drove him to a small storage warehouse on the outskirts of Nairobi. It belonged to an ex-reporter named Lillian Nyaga. Inside, files lined the walls. Yellowed press clippings, photographs, and tapes. Lillian had once investigated government land seizures tied to foreign tourism projects. She offered them one box labeled Talek Corridor, 1987–1989. Inside was a map, marked with grid overlays. Sarah's last known path overlapped directly with a disputed parcel earmarked for a private airstrip, funded partially by foreign investors and local government officials. "They don't like cameras on that land," Lillian said. "You think it was lions? I think she photographed something." At 3:45 p.m. they returned to the fire patch. Daniel scanned the area with an old metal detector. It whined softly, then spiked. He dug, slowly, until something metallic surfaced, a melted flash drive keyring. The USB end twisted and blackened. Back in the hotel, Richard examined it. No label, no way to power it. He placed it in a small steel tin labeled Evidence 4 and locked it in his suitcase. Later that night, the hotel lost power. Richard sat in the dark, watching headlights drift down the road outside. He didn't move. The next morning, he received a courier envelope at the reception desk. No return address. Inside, 3 photographs. One was of Sarah standing by her Jeep, smiling. The second showed the burned patch of earth before it was discovered, taken from a high angle. The third photo showed a government SUV parked beside the gully. The timestamp read, September 9, 5:12 a.m. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been scheduled. Richard placed all 3 photographs in a separate folder marked Chained. The plastic bag holding the button had started to fog. A week after Sarah's disappearance, a call came from a herder near the Mara escarpment. He reported a stench, not animal, rising from a ravine known locally as the Hollow Throat. Rangers dismissed it. Richard didn't. He and Daniel reached the site by late afternoon. Vultures circled overhead. A large rock had been recently moved. Beneath it, nestled in ash and blackened soil, were human remains. Partial, charred bones stacked unnaturally, not scattered as animals would leave them. The femur was fractured. The ribs curled inward. A jawbone sat upright, socket still intact. Near the edge of the site, buried under loose gravel, was a rusted wire looped in a figure-8 knot. Richard didn't speak. He took photos. Daniel marked coordinates. They contacted the British High Commission. Within hours, Nairobi CID dispatched a small team. Forensics arrived in plain clothes, moving quickly. The remains were lifted, catalogued, bagged, and driven off without ceremony. That night, Richard waited outside the morgue, watching through reinforced glass as a technician processed the bones. A small pile of metal debris, belt clasps, molar caps, a zipper, sat beside the trays. The camera Sarah had carried was not among them. At 10:30 p.m., a forensic pathologist named Dr. Wanjiru handed him a printed preliminary report. The bones belonged to a female aged 25–30. Cause of death undetermined. No signs of animal predation. Signs of blunt trauma on the jaw. Knife scoring on vertebrae. Richard looked up. "Can you sign this?" Wanjiru hesitated, then wrote her initials in the lower corner. The following morning, Inspector Akaro arrived at the morgue. His demeanor had shifted. He now wore mirrored sunglasses, even indoors. "Very sad," he said flatly. "We will file this under presumed accidental death. You may collect her belongings." Richard asked about an autopsy. Akaro replied, "You have your answers, Mr. Whitmore. Let the girl rest." Richard refused. He contacted a private forensic expert in Mombasa. The bones were transferred discreetly. A second autopsy revealed more. Shallow cut marks on the sternum. Burn patterns inconsistent with open flames, more akin to accelerant use. The missing hyoid bone suggested manual strangulation. A molar had been removed post-mortem. Richard requested dental records. The British consulate faxed over a chart. One filling matched. Sarah was confirmed. Word leaked. A journalist for the East African Tribune called Richard at 7:10 p.m. Off the record, she said, they wanted this quiet, tourism is down, elections are near, this won't go far. The next morning, a cremation order was signed by a local magistrate backdated. Richard intervened. He arrived at the facility as the body was being wheeled in. He blocked the door and called a lawyer. The body was placed on hold. That evening, the police issued a statement. A tragic accident, no foul play suspected. The story died in one paragraph, but in the evidence room at the British High Commission, the bag labeled Sarah Whitmore now included. Dental chart, jawbone x-ray, second autopsy report, a single molar wrapped in gauze. The bag was sealed in wax, signed by two officials. One signature was smudged. The other was Edward Marlowe's, a political attaché. Richard pinned the bag's barcode to his hotel wall. He stared at it for 6 hours. At 3:11 a.m., the power in his room went out again. The following day, Richard met Daniel at a roadside cafe outside Nakuru. Daniel said nothing at first. He slid a brown envelope across the table. Inside was a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, stained by time and travel. Richard's breath caught. Sarah's handwriting. They opened it carefully. The first pages were full of notes, species lists, shutter settings, sketches of birds and trees. Then came longer entries, observations of villagers displaced near a construction site, complaints about a driver who insisted they avoid certain roads. The final pages darkened. August 30, heard gunshots last night, not poachers, too close. September 3, Peter changed route again, took me near airstrip fencing, got angry when I took photos. September 6, they're hiding something, I think it's land grabs. September 7, morning, going out early to get close to the fence again. Peter refused, going alone. The last sentence was unfinished, saw 2 men with. Then the ink trails off in a jagged line. The back pocket of the journal held a torn photo, blurry, zoomed from far, showing 2 men beside an SUV. One appeared to be Charles Mwandu, a local developer known for aggressive acquisitions. Richard photocopied everything and placed the original in a fireproof case. He scanned the final journal page and blew up the handwriting. Daniel knew a specialist at Nairobi University. Handwriting analysis confirmed the pressure shift mid-line. It indicated sudden panic or a jolt, consistent with being startled or pursued. Meanwhile, Richard traced Mwandu's corporate registrations. Half of his holdings were listed under shell companies. One address pointed to a safari tourism firm where Peter Njoroge had briefly worked. Another traced to a warehouse near Nairobi West, registered under a cousin of Inspector Akaro. The lines began to converge. Back at the hotel, Richard laid out the timeline. August 30, Sarah hears gunshots. September 3, photographs near airstrip. September 6, confrontation with driver. September 7, disappears. September 9, government vehicle seen at ravine. September 10, burned remains found. September 11, cremation ordered. 7 days. Richard returned to the evidence board. He pinned Sarah's journal entry alongside the blown-up photo and placed the scorched USB key below it. 1 image. 1 sentence, 1 piece of missing memory. The next morning, Daniel received a call from a boy who scavenged old electronics from the dump near Eldoret. He said he'd found a broken memory card behind the post office. When asked why he was calling, he replied, "The photo on it looks like her." They drove 6 hours straight. The boy met them under a bridge, handed over the SD card, and vanished. It was cracked at the edge, but partially readable. The one recovered image was damaged, fragmented, but enough remained. It showed Sarah, hands raised, not smiling, a dark shape behind her, a man, shadow only, but his sleeve matched the safari firm's tan uniform. Time stamp, September 7, 8:41 a.m., 18 minutes after she was last seen alive. Richard printed the image and slid it under the plastic of the evidence board. He returned to the burned camera. Inside the lens housing, he discovered something lodged. A curled photo negative, singed but intact. A wide-angle shot, fencing, distant vehicles, and one person in uniform bending over something in the grass. He inverted the image digitally. The figure had Akaro's build. Now he had names, timestamps, and photographs. He walked into the British High Commission at 11:20 a.m. He demanded to speak with Edward Marlowe. Marlowe led him to a private room. Richard laid out the photographs, negatives, the journal. One by one, Marlowe sat in silence. Finally, he said, "If we pursue this, your visa will be revoked. No court in Kenya will convict on this. No press will run it, and we can't guarantee your safety." Richard replied, "You just guaranteed I won't stop." He stood, collected the evidence, walked out. That night the hotel phone rang twice and stopped. The power stayed on, but the hallway lights flickered. The journal's torn page was missing when he returned to his room. Only the stain remained. Richard didn't sleep. He rewound every step. He'd left the journal on the dresser, wrapped in plastic under his notebook. Now the page was gone, not the journal, just that single fragment. Someone had been precise. At 6:10 a.m. he visited the front desk. The night clerk was gone. A new woman shrugged. "There is no night clerk," she said, "only cameras." But the tapes from the 4th floor were unavailable due to a system fault. Richard returned to the evidence board. Every clue remained except that one. The torn page. The one with Sarah's final words. Someone wanted it gone, but not the rest. He called Daniel. They needed to talk to Peter Njoroge again. This time they didn't go through the front gate of the garage. They waited until Peter stepped out the back for a smoke. Richard approached alone. "I know you weren't the driver that day," he said. "You switched with someone." Peter lit his cigarette, eyes scanning the alley. "I also know you were seen near the ravine. 2 men. One was Mwandu." Peter's hand shook slightly. "You don't know anything." Richard leaned in. "I know what my daughter wrote, and I know what you burned." Peter exhaled smoke into his face. "You think anyone will listen to you? They run the courts. They run the land. You think a father with a journal is going to change that?" Richard replied, "I already have." Peter walked off. But that night an unmarked envelope appeared under Richard's door. Inside, a set of receipts, vehicle rentals tied to Mwandu's company, dated September 7 to 9. The license plate on the form matched the one seen in the ravine photo. Someone had printed it and circled it in red pen. Daniel traced the rental office. The clerk had been transferred to Kisumu. When they arrived, the clerk refused to speak. Only after Richard showed him Sarah's photo did the man relent. "She asked too many questions," he said. "They didn't want her to talk." He confirmed Peter rented the Jeep. He confirmed a second man rode with him. The name was false. David Amandi. A dead man's ID, stolen from a hospital morgue 2 years earlier. Now they had forged ID, rental connection, and a link to Mwandu's shell company. Daniel mapped the data. It pointed to one conclusion. Sarah had stumbled onto something built on blood and land, an illicit land seizure corridor connected to tourism development, hidden by burned bodies and forged permits. But before they could publish anything, Daniel was attacked. A motorbike pulled alongside his car. A passenger smashed the window with a pipe. Daniel survived, barely. 12 stitches, a fractured cheekbone. He called Richard from his hospital bed. "They're watching you now." The British High Commission sent an email the next day. Richard was advised to consider his return flight options for safety. He declined. Instead, he filed a legal motion through a Nairobi human rights lawyer, a formal complaint against Charles Mwandu, Peter Njoroge, and unnamed police officials for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and homicide. The court date was set. A public hearing. Pressure mounted. Foreign journalists took interest. BBC Nairobi requested an interview. The night before the hearing, Richard walked alone back to the fire site. The ravine was quiet. Birds moved through the brush. He sat on a flat stone and placed Sarah's remaining journal pages beside him. He whispered each sentence. Then he buried them under the same acacia where the Nikon had been found. At 9:30 a.m. the next morning, the courtroom overflowed. Cameras, recorders, a nation on edge. The judge entered, flanked by armed security, the room silenced. Richard took the stand. He spoke of Sarah, of the camera, of the fire. He produced the journal, the negatives, the receipts. He told the story not as a father but as a witness. Then the defense attacked. They questioned the chain of custody. They claimed fabrication. They called the journal a work of grief, not fact. But when the forensic technician confirmed the lens damage matched the fire's chemical composition, the room stirred. When the pathologist testified about the removed molar, gasps followed. Still, the prosecution stumbled. 2 key witnesses failed to appear. The burned USB was deemed inadmissible. The judge recessed. The next day, the verdict: insufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. Case dismissed. Mwandu walked free. Peter vanished. Richard stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras. He didn't speak. He held up Sarah's journal, then he turned and walked into the light. That night he sat alone in his hotel, the window open, the wind brushing the curtains like breath. The scorched button sat in a dish beside him. The Ziploc bag had begun to cloud again. Richard traced the names in silence. The journal had identified the first, Peter Njoroge, the driver listed on Sarah's booking manifest but absent that day. The rental logs placed him in a different region. Yet one witness placed him near the reserve. His signature was on the vehicle release form. But the timestamp was wrong, 7:45 a.m., after Sarah had already left. The second name came from the blurred photograph found folded in Sarah's journal: Charles Mwandu, a developer, 3 shell companies under his name, each tied to land parcels recently annexed for tourism infrastructure. His public face was clean, charity galas, televised interviews, but on paper the trails were ghosted, payments rerouted, ownership filtered through offshore accounts. The third man, less visible, was Samuel Kibet, a senior wildlife ranger stationed along the disputed corridor. He testified that no civilians were present in that area the week Sarah vanished. But one entry in the gate access log bore his initials and one curious note: foreign female, no clearance, redirected. Dated September 7. Richard gathered the threads and pinned them across the board. Each man, time, place, motive. He filed a private complaint with the Nairobi Integrity Tribunal. An anonymous leak forwarded the complaint to the press. Within 48 hours, a statement was issued by the Office of Land Affairs denying all connections. The denials only sharpened Richard's resolve. Daniel arranged a meeting with a fixer, a former court clerk named Wycliffe who specialized in pulling paper trails from locked drawers. For a price, Wycliffe delivered photocopies, internal memos from Mwandu's office requesting expedited permits, cash withdrawals matching dates of Sarah's disappearance, a security report noting camera incident on seized land. One memo bore a red stamp: intercepted tourist, resolved. Richard handed this to Edward Marlowe at the High Commission. Marlowe didn't flinch. He only asked, "Are you prepared for what won't happen next?" "I'm not here for conviction," Richard replied. "I'm here for permanence." 3 days later, Wycliffe called again. "You'll want this." A hidden ledger from Kibet's outpost never entered into official logs. Inside, names, vehicle tags, timestamps, bribes received. And on one line, a stark note: Whitmore girl diverted East Road, escorted. Forensic examination of the ink and paper matched other 1988 entries. The pen stroke was Kibet's. Richard submitted the ledger to the Commission of Inquiry. Within a week, Kibet was suspended. He vanished 2 nights later. His apartment was found unlocked, his files gone, his dog left unfed. Peter Njoroge was next. Richard waited outside his garage again. This time, Peter saw him, turned, and ran. Daniel chased him through a back alley and cornered him behind a rusted fence. Richard didn't speak. He only held up the journal. Peter crumbled, not with guilt, with fear. "I drove her," he said, But not all the way. Orders changed. They told me take her to the east checkpoint, then leave. I didn't ask, I just drove away. Who gave the order? Richard asked. Peter only said one word, Mwandu. Daniel recorded the confession. They burned 3 copies to DVD. One was placed in a safety deposit box, another sent to BBC Africa. The third delivered directly to the courthouse registrar with the notation, evidence open if silenced. That night a rock shattered Richard's hotel window. No note, no follow-up, just sound. But the confession held. He pinned Peter's photo to the evidence board. Underneath it, a single line, driver, then disposable. The ledger was sealed in a padded envelope and placed in the High Commission archive, labeled by barcode and signed by 2 clerks. At 4:18 a.m., the hotel fire alarm triggered. No fire, but the safe had been moved. The journal was untouched. The flash drive was missing. The file was thinner than it should have been, just 4 pages inside a sealed brown envelope. No cover sheet, no contact names, no stamp of issuance. Yet the language was unmistakably precise, as though it had been written by someone who had learned to mimic authority rather than wield it. Richard opened it with gloved hands, seated alone at the back of a private records room inside a law office in Kilimani. The 4th page caught his eye first. There in bold serif type he saw the line that had shadowed his daughter's case since the beginning. All subsequent media contacts to remain consistent with animal incident narrative. No initials, no attribution, but the language matched that of the police report submitted 2 weeks after Sarah disappeared. Word for word, even the spacing. The font had changed, not the words. He flipped to the first page. A memo header, dated September 10, 1988, addressed internally to the Office of Wildlife Management. It referenced a Category 4 tourist fatality requiring containment coordination. Sarah's name wasn't mentioned, but the location and date left no doubt. The phrasing was careful. Incident to be processed as environmental misadventure unless new facts arise requiring escalation. It was, Richard understood instantly, a directive on how to vanish a case from record. But something was wrong. The paper had a subtle discoloration around the edges, and when held at an angle to the light, the watermark was faint and uneven, not consistent with official Interior Ministry stationery. He placed it under the hotel lamp and saw it then, the microscopic misalignment in the left column, the inconsistent indent on the 2nd paragraph, the small slip of the type along the lower margin. This had not been issued through standard channels. Later that night, Richard took the memo to Daniel. They laid it beside the forged police report from Akaro's office. It didn't take long to spot the link. The same machine had typed both, a mechanical Olivetti 42B, outdated by 1986 and phased out of all federal buildings by early '87. But it hadn't been retired from back offices and district precincts. The forensic signature was clear. The slightly offset lowercase e, the irregular left margin drift after the 3rd line, the compression between the C and the O in coordination. The machine was old, but the damage it wrote was current. We can't say who typed it, Daniel said, but we can prove who didn't. Exactly, Richard replied. It didn't come from Nairobi headquarters. They submitted the document for independent forensic analysis to a lab just outside the city. The report came back 48 hours later, confirmed match, same ribbon intensity, same spacing anomalies, same roller shift. What this meant in the language of courts and commissions was damning but indirect. The memo was forged, typed locally, and disguised to simulate a government directive. The forgery was an echo, not a voice. It mimicked truth to bury it. Richard returned to his board. He pinned the memo under a red string leading to the police statement. On a separate line, he wrote a single word in block letters, identical. Then he stared at it for nearly an hour. By the following morning, the High Commission had already heard. Marlowe requested a private meeting. They met at a neutral cafe, seated across from one another like 2 men negotiating a war that had no rules. "You shouldn't have this," Marlowe said, tapping the edge of the memo. "I didn't ask your permission," Richard replied. Marlowe exhaled slowly. "There's a difference between facts and traction. You have the former. The latter will never arrive." "I don't need traction. I need record." Marlowe paused, stirred his coffee, then said, "You understand what happens next, don't you?" "Yes," Richard said. "Someone will erase this." And that night someone tried. Daniel's apartment was entered, no lock broken, nothing stolen, but every document had been photographed, rearranged, and placed just slightly off-center as if to say, "We were here. Keep going, and next time we won't be polite." A single object had been left on his bed. A hotel receipt with Sarah's name on it, burned at the edges, melted in the center. It was one of the original copies from the lodge she had checked into before disappearing. They had taken it, now they gave it back ruined. Richard received the call at 2:17 a.m. Daniel's voice was flat. "They touched the archive." "Did they take the ledger?" "No, just opened drawers, rifled, left the burned receipt." Richard didn't speak. He simply got up, dressed, and walked through the city's night heat with the memo folded inside his coat. They submitted the forensic results to a magistrate the following day. The magistrate reviewed it in silence and said, "This is political, not legal." Then he stamped the motion with an X and refused to file it. When Richard asked why, the magistrate folded the papers and slid them back across the desk. "Because the memo doesn't exist, you understand." Richard left the building and walked 5 blocks before stopping. Then he turned, walked back in, and handed the file to the clerk at the civil window. "File this under civilian litigation, forgery against the deceased." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You'll lose." "I know," Richard said, "but they'll have to answer." By the next news cycle, the case had been registered. Local press picked it up. The headline was "Restrained. British father alleges fabrication in Safari death," but the damage was done. A shadow had been cast on Akaro's name. 2 days later he resigned. No speech. No statement. Richard received no apology. Only a thin envelope slipped under his hotel door with no sender marked. Inside was a black and white photograph of Sarah, standing beside her Jeep, camera in hand, looking off-frame. It was torn diagonally and had been partially burned at the corner. He recognized it immediately. It had been part of the undeveloped film in her Nikon, the one found buried in the dust. But this version had never passed through his hands. It was a duplicate. That meant the negatives had been copied long before anyone admitted they'd even found the camera. They had always known. From day one. Richard placed the photo in a clear folder and wrote carefully in small block letters at the bottom, "Printed from stolen roll, never logged." Then he put it on the wall beside the forged memo. Both had burn marks. Both had mismatched spacing. Both had been returned like evidence no one could admit to touching. The map was hand-drawn, dated 3 years before Sarah disappeared. Faded grid lines cut across a portion of the Masai Mara, each parcel outlined in red ink. On the surface, it looked like a planning document, standard, bureaucratic, almost dull. But in the bottom right corner, written in a different hand, were 3 letters, EGZ. Daniel found it folded into the back of a filing cabinet inside Charles M. Wandu's private office. Not in the public wing, but in the restricted archives behind a locked interior hallway labeled Infrastructure Liaison. He had bribed a janitor for access, borrowed a uniform, walked in during off hours. He took nothing else, just the map. They spread it across the hotel table that evening. Each red-marked zone overlapped with sections of disputed land that had been formally designated as conservation buffer, land that, by law, could not be sold or developed. Yet the plots had been reassigned, quietly. No public record. One of those plots contained the clearing where Sarah's burned remains were found. Another intersected the route her Jeep had last been seen traveling. A third included the parcel where the fencing in her final photograph stood. Richard stared at the inked lines, tracing them with a gloved finger. "This isn't random," he said. "It's not land, it's corridors." "Transit corridors," Daniel replied. "For vehicles, maybe logistics, maybe even smuggling." And she was in the way. They examined the markings further. Coordinates matched to land registry files Daniel had obtained weeks earlier. 3 of the registered shell buyers shared surnames with local officials in the Interior Ministry. One buyer, listed as Savannah Holdings Limited, was registered at an address in Nairobi that led to an empty office above a closed dental clinic. There were no board members, no phone number, no invoices. Richard called it what it was, a shell to clean the transaction. But the most damning detail came from a small red triangle at the top of the map, near the ridge overlooking the Talik River. Scribbled beside it were 2 words, almost invisible in pencil: camera incident. No date, no location reference, just that. Sarah had gone to that ridge to photograph the fence. She had argued with her driver. She had written about it in her journal. And now, here it was, labeled, logged, noted on a map drawn before her death. She had entered a space already being protected by a system that had no borders. Richard folded the map carefully, placed it between archival sleeves, and stored it inside a fireproof case. Then he wrote a new entry into the evidence register. Land corridor scheme, red zones mapped before disappearance, includes fire site. The connection was no longer speculative. Sarah had wandered into an active land seizure network designed to operate outside public oversight. A network that depended on silence. That silence had a shape now. Richard requested a meeting with the Nairobi Land Tribunal. He presented the map, the coordinates, the forged memo, and the forensic link between the documents. He expected denial. He received dismissal. One commissioner looked up and said, "You don't understand the context. These seizures protect the tourism economy. If people thought every conservation site was secretly being sold off, we'd have riots." Richard replied, "If my daughter hadn't walked into one, maybe I wouldn't understand either." Daniel contacted a contact within the Kenya Anti-Corruption Bureau, not to file a report but to offer a trade, information in exchange for silence. The official, whose name they never learned, reviewed the map and simply said, "This came from Mwandu's office." "Yes, and you took nothing else, just this." The man nodded. "Then I never saw you." They left without shaking hands. Back at the hotel, Richard received another package. No note, no sender. Inside, a flash drive, unmarked. The file folder contained scanned copies of property deeds linked to every red-marked zone on the map, along with signed agreements from ministry officials dated in overlapping intervals. At the top of one PDF, a name appeared that stopped him cold: Edward Marlowe, not as a decision-maker, not as a signer, but as a copied recipient on an internal email string between the Commission for Regional Development and a private investment liaison. The subject line: "Final clearance for reserve corridor, please confirm press blackout." The timestamp: September 14, 1988. Sarah had already been dead 5 days. Richard closed the file. For a long time he said nothing. Then he opened it again. Marlowe had known, not just vaguely, not passively. He had been in the loop. The narrative wasn't just protected by Nairobi, it had been rubber-stamped in London. He met Marlowe at the High Commission the next day. He handed him the flash drive and said, "I want you to tell me which part of this you thought wasn't going to come out." Marlowe looked pale, not shaken, just tired. He didn't deny it. "I was told the matter was already resolved, that there was no victim left to protect, just structures." Structures. Yes, economic, diplomatic, structural continuity. "And Sarah," Marlowe paused, "collateral, you think I'm proud of that?" Richard replied, "I don't care what you are." He walked out. That night the air in Nairobi felt thick with quiet. No new threats, no messages, just a deepening calm, the kind that settles only when both sides know what lines have been crossed. They returned to the archive. The map was pinned in the center, flanked by the flash drive scans. The forged memo, the photograph of Sarah beside the Jeep, and the journal page with the final line, "Saw 2 men with." Below it, Richard placed a final caption, written in black ink: "Network confirmed, but no one names the architect." He stepped back. The red ink on the map had begun to bleed through the paper. The hallway outside Daniel's hospital room smelled like disinfectant and dust. He lay motionless under the white sheet, breathing steady but shallow, one arm wrapped in gauze, the other hand tethered to an Roman 4 line. The attack had come without warning. A motorcycle had pulled up beside his car at 9:12 a.m., slowed just long enough for the passenger to shatter the window and slam a pipe through the glass. 2 blows, one to the shoulder, one to the side of the head. He survived, barely. Richard sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, silent. On the side table sat Daniel's phone, wallet, and a manila envelope stained with blood on one corner. Inside it was a copy of the land corridor map and 3 photographs, each labeled by hand. One image showed Sarah's Nikon half buried in soil. Another, the typewriter-forged police report. The last, a zoomed-in still from the fencing zone, showing a man in uniform bending toward something in the grass. The timestamp on the photo placed it at 5:12 a.m., September 9. There had been no sunlight at that hour. Only firelight or headlights could have exposed the film. The doctors said Daniel would wake within 48 hours. Richard didn't wait. He took the envelope and left the hospital without telling anyone where he was going. At 11:30 a.m., he arrived at the offices of the East African Standard. The building was worn down, its glass doors fogged with grime and old headlines taped to the walls. A young reporter named Tandio met him in the lobby. She'd been following the civil suit against the Nairobi Police Department and had reached out 2 weeks earlier. Richard had never replied. Now he handed her the envelope. She flipped through the contents. Her expression didn't change, but her grip on the papers tightened. Richard said only one sentence. "They tried to kill the man who took these." She asked nothing more. He left before she finished reading. That evening, a story ran quietly on the paper's second page. No names, no accusations, just the headline: "New evidence may undermine official safari death narrative." Inside the article, the corridor map was referenced indirectly. A quote from an unnamed source confirmed the existence of unauthorized property transfers overlapping with reported tourist fatality zones. The flash drive documents were described as inconclusive but alarming. The tone was cautious, almost clinical, but it was enough. The next morning, Richard received a voicemail. The voice was female, Kenyan accent, flat tone. "You are opening things we closed for a reason. Be careful what you archive." He saved the message. Then he drove to the university where he had begun establishing a forensic storytelling lab. It was still just a room, shelves, 2 projectors, 4 locked cabinets. He walked past the empty desks, placed the envelope inside a secure drawer, and signed the chain of custody log in block letters. At 4:25 p.m. he called the High Commission. He asked to speak with Marlowe. The receptionist told him Marlowe had gone on indefinite leave. No explanation given. Richard hung up without leaving his name. 2 days later, Daniel woke up. His voice was hoarse but functional. He asked for the map. Richard placed it on his lap. Daniel traced the red triangle again. Then he whispered, "She wasn't a witness. She was a breach." They didn't speak after that for nearly 5 minutes. Outside the hospital window, clouds gathered over Nairobi. Thunder rolled low but never broke. That night, Richard sat alone in his hotel room and reopened Sarah's journal. He flipped past the wildlife sketches, the shutter notes, the names of birds she had photographed. He stopped on the last legible page. September 7, morning, fence post, 2 men. One word caught his eye, a word he had overlooked before. It wasn't just "saw 2 men with a gas can." It was the phrase just before, "They weren't supposed to be there." That sentence changed everything. It meant Sarah knew where she was. It meant she understood the boundary, which meant she had a reason to believe it had been crossed. The men hadn't surprised her. The location had. He placed the journal on the table beside the burned hotel receipt. The 2 objects didn't belong together. Different materials, different timelines, but something about their pairing unsettled him. He called Tandio the next morning and asked her if she had ever heard the name EGZ. She hesitated, then said, "It's a subcommittee inside the Ministry of Land Use, technically dormant, but it was tied to reserve corridor plans in the 80s. Richard asked her to send everything she had. She did. 64 pages of scanned minutes, all redacted except one line in an internal meeting from August 1988. EGZ recommends internal stabilization of visual exposure risk near taillock fencing. Sarah had walked into the center of that phrase. She had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. Her camera didn't capture a crime. It captured proof that the network was operating visibly, materially, and illegally. Richard printed the meeting note, pinned it beside the fencing photo, and added a line in pen. She wasn't a victim. She was an event. At 3:10 p.m., a package arrived at the university lab with no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a plastic evidence bag. Sealed inside it was Sarah's missing molar, the one removed post-mortem, tagged by the second autopsy and stored under official seal. But this seal had been broken. The bag resealed with unmarked tape. Richard turned it over 3 times. Then he placed it in the cold archive cabinet and logged it as entry 0319. Recovered post-evidence. Unknown chain. Presence intended as message. He didn't need to write more. That night, phone rang once. He didn't answer. The molar sat under refrigerated glass, perfectly intact. It had not decayed, not yet. The trial was scheduled for the first week of December. The courtroom sat on the 3rd floor of the Nairobi Regional Judiciary Building, a space that smelled of dry wood, old air, and something else, something metallic. The windows were sealed shut. The ceiling fan clicked every few seconds, never rotating fast enough to move the heat. The case was civil. There were no criminal charges. No one on trial. Just an accusation that the Nairobi Police Department under Inspector Joseph Akaro had knowingly submitted falsified documents to obstruct an investigation into the death of a foreign national. Richard entered the courtroom at 9:10 a.m., wearing a dark suit that hadn't seen use in years. He carried no briefcase, only a folder labeled in block letters. Sarah Whitmore, 1988. Daniel walked beside him, slower now, a visible scar beneath his temple. The prosecution opened with a timeline. It was clean, cold, mechanical, the forged police report, the memo typed on the Olivetti 42B, the forensic spacing analysis, the map marked with land corridors overlapping the fire site, the journal entry about the fencing, the email chain naming Marlowe, and the reappearance of the molar, unsealed, days after being archived. They did not call it murder. They called it an engineered disappearance. The defense responded by attacking origin. The documents were found, not filed. The forensic lab was independent, not state certified. The journalist was young, the chain of custody non-existent. They suggested that the journal could have been edited, that the map could have been planted, that the forensic signature on the typewriter might exist on dozens of similar machines across East Africa. They called no witnesses, only raised doubt. But doubt had become the courtroom's background noise. It hummed like the fan above. Richard was called to testify on the second day. He stepped forward slowly, placed his folder on the stand, and opened it with both hands. Inside were 10 documents. Each had been numbered, dated, and rescanned that morning to show digital integrity. He spoke clearly, coldly. "I am not a lawyer. I am not a policeman. I'm a father who followed language across 3 decades, and every phrase I found was about erasure." He held up the police report, the forged one. "This was typed after my daughter was dead." Then the memo. "This was typed to make sure no one asked how." He paused. "I am not here to punish anyone. I am here to pin the truth to the wall so it cannot be erased a second time." The courtroom was silent. The judge, an older man with reading glasses and a voice like dust, asked one question. "Do you believe this was an accident?" Richard replied, "No. I believe she saw something that had already been buried, so they buried her next." Daniel was not asked to speak, but his presence alone, bandaged and visibly altered, reminded the room that the consequences of silence were never metaphorical. The opposing counsel requested an adjournment. Denied. Closing arguments began. The prosecutor leaned on sequence, the overlap of dates, the contradiction of physical space. the presence of a burned camera lens found beside land marked for development, the file sent to Marlowe before Sarah's body was even confirmed, the disappearance of the driver, the forged documents typed after the fact, the return of a molar no one should have had access to. The defense leaned on ambiguity, the fog of time, the absence of fingerprints, the unreliability of memory, the limits of inference. When it was over, the judge requested 3 days for review. They delivered the verdict on a Monday. The courtroom was full. Foreign press had returned. Photographers leaned in doorways. The judge began with a list of what could not be proven. No proof of murder. No direct evidence linking the forged memo to any specific official. No way to confirm chain of custody for the molar. No surviving witness to the moment of death. Then he turned to what could. He acknowledged that the police report had been altered, that the memo was forged, that government officials had been aware of Sarah's presence in the corridor, that documents had been willfully misfiled, misdated, and misrepresented to delay investigation. He stated that the cumulative impact of these actions amounted to systemic obstruction, but the judgment ended there. No penalties, no arrests, only a single line entered into court record. The state recognizes that the original inquiry into the disappearance and death of Sarah Whitmore was compromised by deliberate falsification and administrative concealment. It wasn't justice. It was a confession without consequence. Richard left the courtroom without speaking. Daniel followed behind, moving slowly through the reporters, saying nothing. Later that evening, back at the archive, Richard placed the printed judgment into box 54, beside the photo of Sarah with her camera and the Olivetti ribbon sample sealed in glass. He labeled it, "Acknowledged, not answered." At 10:47 p.m., the power went out in the building. For 6 minutes, the archive sat in darkness. When the lights returned, nothing was missing, but on the central board, someone had pinned a blank page over the journal photo. Just one sentence typed in red ink. "You won the record. That's all you'll ever get." The air in the archive room the next morning felt stiller than usual. Not silent, the hum of fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, but something had shifted. The red-inked message remained pinned to the center of the board, untouched, mocking in its restraint. "You won the record. That's all you'll ever get." Richard didn't remove it. He didn't touch it. He simply placed a transparent acrylic sheet over the paper, screwed it into the cork with 4 short brass pins, and logged the entry in his notebook. Unauthenticated intrusion, no physical damage, psychological intent clear. Artifact preserved as is. He turned back to the shelves. The work wasn't over. It never would be. Over the following weeks, the Sarah Whitmore case stopped appearing in newspapers. The court had spoken. There would be no follow-up. No reopening, no arrests. The story had reached its procedural conclusion. But in the background, fragments continued to echo. A retired journalist named Emmanuel sent an envelope from Mombasa. Inside was a cassette tape and a single-type transcript, unsigned. It contained a radio interview from 1989 that never aired. The guest was a former junior ranger, anonymous then, anonymous still. The tape hissed, low fidelity, but his words cut through. She wasn't alone that day. There was a second vehicle, black Land Cruiser. No markings, parked across the ridge from her. I was told not to log it. Richard digitized the audio, matched the voice to a former reserve staffer who died in 2001. The man's name had appeared once in the margin of a shift roster found in box 17. The forensic link was indirect, but the echo was exact. He added the cassette to the archive under code, Vox 8904 unched. In April, a woman came to the archive. She was quiet, dressed in beige, and introduced herself only as Miriam. She said her father had worked in the Talek Corridor operations team. He died in 1992. She had kept his journal. Inside were 3 pages about land disputes. Nothing unusual. But taped to the final page was a photo, low resolution, black and white, aerial. It showed 3 jeeps lined side by side on a cleared ridge, just beyond the border of the official development zone. 2 of the license plates were obscured. One was visible. The plate matched the vehicle assigned to Sarah's original driver, Peter Njoroge. Richard scanned it, cross-referenced the VIN through old maintenance records, and confirmed its last registered sighting, September 7, 1988, at a service depot near Narok. The plate had never been logged at the eastern checkpoint. She was rerouted. Not lost, not diverted, redirected. He placed the photo beside the corridor map. A new pin, a new line, another thread connecting the fire site, the ridge, and the last known position of a vehicle that should never have been where she was found. Outside, a student pressed her face to the window. She'd heard the archive held secrets. Richard waved her in, showed her the drawer where the burned button was stored. The entry tagged Molar 001. The torn journal. The map. The falsified memo. The Olivetti ribbon sample. The returned photograph. She asked why he kept it all. Richard said, "Because memory is stronger than verdict." She nodded and said nothing more. By June, the archive filled its last drawer. Box 64 was sealed with reinforced straps. Inside were clippings, images, microfilm, and 3 items recovered from unofficial sources. One of them was a VHS tape with no label. Just a handwritten note that read, "South Fence, 1988, Segment 7. He didn't watch it that day. Instead, he walked to the museum at the university's south wing. Room 3B had been updated. New lighting. Better preservation. The central case now held Sarah's Nikon, the lens cracked, the film empty, the strap half melted. Beside it a placard read, "Sarah Whitmore, recovered, Masai Mara, Kenya, 1988. Camera submitted without chain of custody. Cause unresolved. No mention of land seizures. No forged documents. No molar. But it was something, a marker, a boundary against forgetting." He stood in the center of the room and stared for 12 minutes. Then he left without a word. That night he returned to the archive, opened the sealed VHS envelope, inserted the tape. The screen flickered, grayscale, no sound. It showed a stretch of fencing, wind blowing dust. No people, just a slow pan across the ridge. Then at the edge of the frame a figure appeared, small, standing beside a camera tripod, the image distorted just enough to obscure the face. But he knew it was her. She adjusted the lens, looked up once, tilted her head. Then, in the final 2 seconds, another shape moved in from the left. The tape ended before contact, but the motion was fast, deliberate, not natural. He rewound it, watched again and again. Then he placed the tape back in the envelope and sealed it in a lead-lined case. Logged it as tape 88 final. He turned off the lights, set the dehumidifier, locked the cabinets. At 11:52 p.m., Richard made one last entry in the logbook. The record is intact, and the silences have names now. Then he closed the book. Outside, rain began to fall. The molar under sealed glass had begun to yellow at the edges.